We have another live weekend planned, this time in Chicago from June 3rd to the 5th. It'll be called Unregistered Live, and it'll feature walking tours, live podcasts from several different podcasters, special guests, and much, much more. And it is available for a very steep discount only to members of the Unregistered Underground. To become a member of the Unregistered Underground, go to patreon.com/unregistered. And I can't wait to see you in Chicago. This is the Unregistered podcast, and I'm Thaddeus Russell. This is a show about ideas, people, and behaviors that are considered inappropriate, out of bounds, or beyond the pale. The things you're not supposed to talk about if you're a school teacher, a college professor, a businessman, a politician, a parent, a neighbor, or even a podcast host. These are the things you're not supposed to say or even think if you're a good liberal, a good conservative, or a good citizen. Each week, I'll interview a person who has something bad to say. They might be a journalist or a professor. They might be a porn star or a drug dealer. They might just be an ordinary person with an ordinary job who doesn't care about the rules of polite society. I'm not interested in breaking the rules just to be a troublemaker. I'm interested in people who break the rules of conventional thought and to expand the scope of what is possible to say in our society. I'm interested in people who make me think. I met this week's guest 10 years ago in my living room to watch a UFC fight. At that time, neither one of us was even listening to podcasts, and he had never studied history professionally. Well, now, he is one of the most respected podcasters in the history field, and his podcast, Martyrmade, has been cited as one of the very best of the genre. I'm so excited to have him on my show, finally, after all these years, now that we are both podcasters and both historians. This is my interview with Darryl Cooper. I am joined from San Diego, California by Darryl Cooper, an old friend of mine. We met 10 years ago, actually in my living room, watching a UFC fight. And ever since then, a lot has changed for both of us. Neither one of us at that point had a podcast. I don't think either one of us was even thinking about it. And now we both do. In fact, you have two podcasts. You are the host of the Martyrmade podcast and the co-host of Unraveling with Jocko Willink. And both have made quite an impact. We were friends. I knew about you, but then I started hearing about your, was it your first podcast you did on Israel Palestine?
Yeah, the first 6 episodes of the podcast are a long form series on.
Man, Darryl, I got to tell you, Darryl, I heard from a dozen people independently that was the best treatment of the Israel Palestine issue they'd ever heard. That was just true. Beginning with Daniele Bolelli, our mutual friend, he said, "You've got to listen to this guy." And over the years, I've heard other just continually positive reviews of your podcast, and especially also your series on Jim Jones and People's Temple, which is near and dear to my heart, because I grew up. You probably don't know this.
I do. I'm a Thaddeus Russell podcast fan.
Oh, okay. Oh, wow. Okay, so you know that I grew up in that neighborhood in Southwest Berkeley. Yeah, partly. Yeah. So that's where a lot of the People's Temple people were. So that was really cool. But yeah, man. So you actually started your podcast before Unregistered started. Martyrmade was before that. You've been doing this for a while, and then you've been working with Jocko for now what, a year or two?
Yeah, I moved down to San Diego to work with him full time last February.
Okay.
So,
yeah,
we were going to start the year before, but then the world ended, and so we delayed that for a little bit. And
right.
Eventually, we realized the world was just going to keep ending for an indefinite period of time, and so we decided to go ahead and do it.
That is how it feels, isn't it? It just keeps ending. There's like one false climax after another. I keep thinking, when is this the final one? It's like one of those Marvel movies where you think the movie's over, but no, there's another galactic fight that we have to go through. So your Martyrmade is I think it's in the genre of the Dan Carlin, Daniele Bolelli history podcast where you go super deep on the research and you just get all the way into a historical topic and then you deliver it in a very clear, accessible, dramatic narrative form, which is just Dan Carlin kind of, I think, right, he pioneered that. Daniele kind of took it up, and now you guys are kind of perfecting it. You're known for that, and it's like some of the best work you'll ever find, just among historians, but especially popular historians. I mean, you're just not going to find a better treatment of like the stuff that you've worked on than your podcast. I want to say that.
Thank you.
And then you became a presence on Twitter in the last couple of years too. You got a lot of attention, and it's funny, you know, I keep hearing different things about you. Like sometimes I hear, God, Darryl's really right wing. I don't know, why is he so right wing? And other times I'm like, I hear Darryl's like a little communist. What's happening over there? He's so left wing. It's unseemly.
Yeah, it's something I get a lot actually. Ever since I finished or started doing the Israel Palestine podcast, which is done now, I would say like half the emails that I get are from pro-Israel or Israeli people telling me that I'm a shill for the Palestinians, and some of it's from pro-Palestinian activists telling me I'm a shill for the Israelis. So that means I'm doing something either very right or very wrong. I'm not sure.
Very right. You're doing something very right. All right. So some people now know who you are, I think, basically. And in terms of, you know, your public persona, I want to talk this story. And you have a very interesting backstory. When I met you again 10 years ago, neither one of us were doing any of this stuff. And you had a big job with who?
I worked for the government, for the Department of Defense. I spent 20 years, some of it in the active duty military, but 20 years doing air and ballistic missile defense, electrical engineering work for the government and for our allies as well. You know, we sell a lot of weapon systems to a lot of our allies. When we do that, we don't give them enough information to, you know, say backwards engineer it and then cut us out of the loop or something. And so whenever something serious needs to be upgraded or it breaks or you go through testing evolutions, I would hop around the world to go participate in that kind of thing. So,
wow.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun. It was a good job, and it gave me a lot of insight into, because you know, when you're, even though it was a technical job, we spend a lot of time discussing what the technical aspects of these systems need to be in order to fulfill our strategic objectives. And so, you know, it was kind of an education in that as well.
Okay. So here's the thing about Darryl. I don't know if you know this, but like committed lifelong anti-war activists like me know basically nothing about the military and about actually, you know, what actually goes on inside the military. Most of us are not, you know, even clear about like the ranks and the most basic shit. And it's actually, it's embarrassing. It's something we should all be embarrassed by. And one of the things, you know, I would love to talk to Jocko. One of the reasons I would love to talk to Jocko and you someday is for you guys to educate me because I'm Mr. Anti-war. This war's bad. That intervention's terrible. And the United States is the devil, basically, is my line. But there's so much I do not know on the granular, on the ground level that Jocko and you know both well.
Yeah, real quick, you're not alone on that, because this has always been the case to some degree, but over the last several decades, we've developed this massive disconnect between the military and the rest of the population.
Right.
You know, if you actually look at who joins the military, like me, I had a grandfather, 2 uncles, et cetera, who were in the military, and most people are like that. So, you know, it's this intergenerational thing that is almost like a caste, a military caste. And the people who aren't a part of that, you know, you go find somebody who knows a person in the military and you'll find they know a dozen people in the military. Go find someone who doesn't, and they almost never meet a person that was ever in the military. So it's just very, very much a disconnect that I think we would do well to try to repair a little bit.
Let's do that right now before we get back into your history, because this is a major part of American political and military history, basically since Vietnam is what we're talking about, right? The disconnect, the growing disconnect between Americans and the American military and foreign policy generally. I mean, I can describe it. I can start, they stopped the draft. That's number one, right? In the mid 70s, that kind of disconnected us from, we were no longer as afraid of getting thrown into these conflicts. But the stuff that you know more about, right? The kind of remote control warfare, right? Do you want to talk about sort of what's happened since the Vietnam War to, and then of course there's the media no longer covering wars, which I really want to talk about with you, which may be the worst problem of all. how would you describe this, and what's happened over the last 50, 60 years?
Well, one of the interesting things that happened during Vietnam was, we like, that was the origin of a lot of the problems and battles that we're seeing throughout our society and our politics today, right? That's kind of a cliche to say, but when the way it actually developed throughout the 1960s, I mean, you know the history of the New Left pretty well. I know you do, because I've listened to you talk about it. And so you look at things like, the development of SDS in the early 60s. SDS obviously was a venerable old organization, been around since 1905. Jack London.
For people who don't, Students for Democratic Society, for people who don't know.
It was like the primary youth, like student left-wing activist group for many, many years. And in the 1960s, early in the 1960s, he starts to blow up. You get leaders, like really charismatic leaders like Tom Hayden, who are doing work. And the older socialists, the democratic socialists from the adult organizations that were the parent to SDS, these are people who were democratic socialists, trade unionists for sure, strong left-wing people, but they were American patriots. These were people who had been through World War II, people who liked the New Deal, for example, and a lot of people, obviously there was a heavy Jewish presence in a lot of these left-wing organizations, especially in the leadership, and a lot of these people had come from Europe and they had experienced what was going on over there. And so once they had come over here and their lives stabilized, I mean, a lot of the leaders, like in SDS, their parents were resistance fighters in France, people like that. So they finally make it over to America, and they obviously are very anti-fascist. They've been through that, but they're anti-communist as well. And throughout the 20s, 30s, and into the 40s, you see these battles for control over the trade unions between communists and just old school democratic socialist types who don't want that, right? Because the Communist Party at the time was just straight up agent of Moscow. The Communist Party USA was receiving funding from Moscow, et cetera. And the old school socialists would complain that we're in here trying to have basically a democratic organization, right? We're going to get up here and give this position, you give that position. Everybody's going to listen to both sides, weigh it, and we're going to vote on which direction to take, or something like that. But the communists didn't operate like that. The communists would come in, work as a block, take over a committee, figure out how they could leverage that to change some rules, to take over another part. And then once they had enough control of the organization, they would change all the rules so that they kept control. And then that would be it. And then, so of course, what would happen was you'd get J. Edgar Hoover or, Joe McCarthy, who would come in and just, put him on his dinner plate and carve him up. And all the people who were ever associated with that group, even if they left because the communists came in, well, those are now people, as far as Joe McCarthy's concerned, who have ties to communist organization. And so they'd been through these battles, and a lot of them like literal street battles, like fighting in the streets with these people. And they had developed like a very, very thick armor when it came to communists. And so the old school trade unions and the older socialists had a rule: no communists. And they said no totalitarians, but what it was communists are allowed in these organizations. They're not allowed to walk in the front door of these organizations. And they were able to sort of explain that to the younger generations for a long time, because it's kind of easy when, the communism means the Soviet Union, right? And they can tell them, like, look at what's going on in Hungary in 1956. Like, that's bad, they're bad, and you're not allowed to indulge any of that. Okay, fine. You get into the post-colonial period in the 50s and the 60s as these things start to come apart. And now all of a sudden, keeping out a communist means, you can't let somebody in who supports Cuba, right? And so that's a different thing. And it's a much harder case to make than it is to, stay away from the Soviet Union. And then of course, Vietnam comes along, and now people who support the Vietnamese liberation movement, now they're banned. And eventually, they just lost control of the student movement. The students didn't have the experience with the communists to know why these rules were so important to the older people. And this disconnect between the older and younger activists starts to come apart until 1965. SDS changed its charter, took out the part that said no totalitarianism. The older organizations cut them off, and they kind of sailed in opposite directions. And then, of course, within a few years, the adults' prophecy came true. And first they were taken over by progressive labor, a bunch of crazy Maoists in 1967, 1968, 69, they're taken over by the Weathermen. And then within a few months of that, they just steal all the money from the organization to pay their bail from the days of rage and then disband the organization, right? And so it's exactly what they kind of said was going to happen. And in that period in the 1960s, this is a long way to get around to like my actual point here. You had obviously the Vietnam War is very famous for, especially in the first several years, being a very class-based war. This was something that was fought disproportionately by the lower classes. You could, with university exemptions and everything, which is actually very interesting because in our volunteer army today, there's kind of a, you'll see it every once in a while. People will say, kind of without providing statistics, because if they tried, they would find out that they were wrong, but that the military today is like a bunch of, say, black and brown people or poor people who are going over to fight these wars in Iraq. And that's actually not true, especially if you look at the actual combat forces, the frontline combat forces, the infantry and so forth. There's actually a higher share of white soldiers. There's a higher share of middle class and above soldiers than there are poor soldiers. It's a little bit less so if you mix in the rear echelon stuff, but that is something that exists today. But back then, obviously, that wasn't the case, right? You had massive numbers of just, people who didn't go to college, basically, or weren't eligible for college, going over there to fight. You had a bunch of college students back home who had exemptions from it and very much didn't want to get drafted and were anti-war activists. And, you sort of got into this, when they go out and protest and they're getting their heads smacked by the Chicago police or something, those police are guys with brothers and nephews and sons and so forth that are over in Vietnam.
Right.
You have like the Hard Hat Riot in 1970 in New York, like that famous incident. And you start to like get this disconnect between, the sort of ideological break of the right and left starts to become a class division as well. And now, very much, I think today, the children of each of those groups, not man to man, obviously, person to person, like there's some, some things have changed, but that those are basically the people who were fighting with each other today.
That's right. That's brilliant, Darryl. I hadn't thought of that. Yeah, generationally. So you can trace it back to, was it 70, the Hard Hat Riot in New York? 1970? Yeah. Right. Sort of iconic. I mean, it's become bigger sort of as iconography than an actual event, but whatever. Sure. Hard hat union workers in New York City staged basically a pro-Vietnam protest, and there were hippies there who were against it, and they kind of fought in the streets, blah, blah, blah. But it was seen as representing exactly this, what you're talking about, this cultural conflict within the United States around communism and America's place in the world and exceptionalism and all that stuff, right? And yeah, you're right. It's still cultural. I mean, I think the descendants of those hard hats now vote for Donald Trump and maybe other Republicans, and the descendants of the hippies are me.
So there was the hippies, right? But then also you had, you had a lot of the hardcore anti-war, like left-wing activists. Like
that's more my parents. Yeah.
These guys were going around with shaved heads. They didn't smoke. They didn't drink. Like they were hardcore, and all of their models and like the myths that they held on to were all like old school, like 1930s, like militancy from Europe. Like that's the kind of mode they were in, And so it came in like all types. But over the years, like all of those various types that were generally on that side with regard to the war and the civil rights movement and stuff, as time has gone on and they had their kids and their kids grew up and went to college and became college professors, that those things kind of coalesced into this, mostly into this neoliberal kind of progressive, whatever you want to call it. Right and left are very hard to mean anything these days, I think. But yeah, so that's kind of where we're at today.
Well, so I guess, but you're talking about, again, it's cultural, right? So the anti-war people in the streets in 1970, both the hardcore politicos, who were my parents, by the way, and the hippies, culturally, like their children and their children's children, we think of this is really important. I grew up in Berkeley. Everybody knows this, right? I'm completely from that world. We think of the military as just this profoundly uncool thing.
Yeah.
You know what it's like, Darryl, to us? The military is like Walmart. Walmart is just, we would never go there. We would never go there. That's a working
million ways. In a million ways other than the one you mean, you are completely correct about
Yep.
that.
Yeah. Right. It's just,
Yes.
and this is, I think this is why much of the left has disdain for the working class, because they don't like Walmart, because the working class is tacky. The cultural signifiers chosen by the American working class, especially the white working class, is seen as beneath the dignity of the urban, intellectual, bi-coastal, highly educated elite who would never wear a uniform and go fight in a war, because that's so tacky and unseemly, and because it involves perhaps hurting brown people. But that's not, they don't even go that far. It's just not what we do. We have better things to do, Darryl. We have to be professors in colleges and have podcasts and tell people how to think. We have much better things to do than actually fight. Right?
Yeah, I mean, it's been like that for, there's a famous incident or series of incidents back in 1969 when the Weathermen, after they took over SDS, were planning the Days of Rage. Mm-hmm. And they sent their people out to cities and towns all over the Midwest, because it was going to take place in Chicago, to go out to high schools, construction sites, factories, all these different places where the workers lived, right? And where the workers were at, to go out there and start telling these people about, how the war is just evil and awful, and America's a fascist Nazi state, and we got to go do that. And it's just story after story of them going out and either getting thrown out of the places or getting their asses kicked by, when you're reading a book about like the history of SDS and you get to the part where like they're going to go to a construction site or an auto mechanic shop in Akron to tell all these guys that America's a Nazi state, you start like bearing down, because this is going to be good, right? And it was good. You got guys like Mark Rudd who got their ass kicked, and so there's this something that developed in the mentality of like the youth left in the 1960s. Again, the intellectual development of this is very understandable in a way, right? If you go back to like 61, when the Freedom Riders were doing their thing, and you look at these people, which were black and white activists who were taking, the Supreme Court had ruled that these things had to be desegregated, but the states in the South weren't doing it. And so they said, well, we need to go down and actually challenge this so that it becomes a thing that we can actually force it to change. And so they knew that if they sent a bunch of black people down on the bus, what was going to happen was those black people were going to get their asses kicked and nobody was going to care. That's what would happen. And so a bunch of white people, like 30-40% very often, hopped onto these buses, and they were going down to Jackson and Birmingham and like the absolute heart of the Deep South, where their presence was not wanted, to say the least, right? And they went down there and they got their asses kicked. A lot of them, there was an incident where they put a bunch of people in the hospital, and then they had to evacuate the hospital because the mob was going to storm the hospital. And so this was like what these people are doing, these incredibly courageous people, right? And one of the things that you, once you start reading into it, again, as you're aware, is that of those white freedom riders, huge number of them, 70-80% were Jewish, right? And we can all understand why. Like in 1961, when most of white America, even liberal white America in the big cities and stuff, is just waking up to kind of what's going on down in the South, because the Freedom Rides were one of the first things that like were mass televised at a time where there's 50 million television sets in the US now. And so instead of just reading about it, you're seeing these images of burning buses and broken bodies. And Americans are just starting to wake up to this, not the Jews who are in America. They were aware of what was going on here from the very beginning for obvious reasons, right? They looked around and they said, I see a bunch of people in uniforms spraying fire hoses, and for just a bonus effect, using German shepherds, against these defenseless civilians, these stoic protesters, of Martin Luther King or whatever. And they say, I know what this is. I know exactly what this is. And so they were on top of it very early.
Well, I was going to say it's also because Jews have been always grossly overrepresented among left-wing left-wing organizations and movements. I don't mean grossly, meaning largely overrepresented, not in a bad way. Yeah. So they were aware of what was going on because of that.
So this starts happening in the early 60s, where they start getting these confrontations, and they see Bull Connor in his uniform and all his sheriffs. They see the protesters, the Martin Luther King protesters, who are getting attacked and beaten up. But they also see something else, is they see the crowd of people, civilians all around, who are cheering on the fire hose wielding cops and screaming epithets at the black protesters and stuff. And over time, you start to get this idea that, Nazis, like the Nazi regime, in like the actual Nazi regime, the regimes like this don't operate in a vacuum. They need a support base. And that's who these people are. And so these working class people, yeah, they might be poor, they might be like underprivileged in their own ways, but these are essentially Germans who are standing by at best, as Hitler comes to power and does his thing. And so these people are actually the enemy too. These are the people who support Vietnam. These are the people who maybe have just not caught up with like the social and moral evolution when it comes to civil rights yet. It takes time for people with different assumptions and different ideas of the world to kind of get the message. And so that's how they started to see these people as like part of the problem. And you obviously going to run into some serious issues when you have the people who are university educated, who have most of the money, who have most of the political power and institutional power, starting to look on people below them as a moral and social and political problem, right? And so that bifurcation like started to explode in the 60s, and now obviously it's had many decades for those boomers, because that's who these people were, to grow up and become the people who lead all of our institutions now. And it's, I think the election of Donald Trump it blew the lid off that suppressed hostility that had been like roiling under the surface for many decades and building up.
Yes, the fights that began in the 1960s over those kinds of issues are culminating in the 2020s, aren't they? This is it. This is maybe the final showdown, because that generation, it will be gone soon. And it in a way, it is sort of it's like an intra-boomer fight, sort of, right? Between the Joe Biden faction of the boomers and the Donald Trump faction of the boomers, in a sense. But but back to my original question, which is the disconnect between Americans generally and questions of foreign policy and war, and we just don't give a shit. I mean, how many Americans can identify even where what continent Syria is on? I think it's something like 8%, something like that. We don't care. We haven't cared in a long time. So we kind of explained why, like, the elites don't want to muddy their minds in foreign policy, because they're certainly not going to muddy their bodies in it. What else has led to the fact that right now, I think a tiny percentage of Americans even know what's happening in Ukraine at all, like that there's even a military conflict in Ukraine, and God forbid ask an American what NATO is or what Article 5 of NATO is. I mean, what percent? I want this done, man. I want a survey done in which we ask Americans one simple question. Do you know what Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization says? What do you think that is? What do you think percentage is? It's got to be less than 10.
It's definitely less than 10.
Think about that. We are obligated to go to war to defend Montenegro, and we don't even know that. I mean, that is pretty bad.
It's a situation, right, where like part of it is technological development. When you have a war that's fought by drones, people don't have to care as much.
Right.
It doesn't affect them as much. Part of it is that the nature of warfare, like actual tactics, have changed to, we're not sending 80 divisions through Belgium to go into France anymore.
Right.
It's just not how it works. There's not like, millions of people with massed artillery doing frontal charges or anything. It's much smaller force, like we have a large standing army, but it wouldn't have been the 10th largest army in 1914, right? And so it's not as many people who are actually involved in absolute and especially relative numbers. The fact that a lot of, if you actually look at, especially our combat forces, where they come from, you have a big disproportionate share that come from Appalachia and a few states like Texas and Florida. The joke in military is we wouldn't have an infantry if Texas and Florida seceded. And so, it's just the number of people who are involved is smaller. The fact that we don't have a draft, it's an all volunteer force. And just the fact that like we could be, you think of what a historical anomaly this is. The fact that we were at war, like really at war in 2 different countries, and we had operations going on in a dozen or more countries. And if you didn't have a TV or you didn't check your phone, you would not have known that those things were happening. Like they do not affect you. You're not in gas lines. You're not like getting food rations or anything like that.
Right.
And so it's very easy, like, to just not care about it. And I think, on one hand, like, I think an ideal situation, right, if we had a functional society, would be that most people don't have to think about that stuff, that you have a media and a government that basically tells you what's going on, basically, and that most people, most of the time, can focus on their families and their communities and what their kids are doing at school and all that kind of stuff. Like, you don't want your entire population completely like focused on politics all the time, because then you get what we have now these last several years. Right. I mean, politics is just as a broad topic, it's not something that everybody, or I would even say that very many people, are really emotionally or psychologically equipped to be engaged with all the time. It encourages paranoia, it encourages us versus them thinking, and all of these kind of things that if you are, unless you're like a really kind of emotionally stable and in control type of person, that those things can get the best of you. They get the best of a lot of government officials. Think about guys like James Jesus Angleton or James Forrestal, guys who just became paranoid and went crazy, and so let alone like a normal person who's getting their information through sensationalized media and so forth. And so ideally that would be great if, like, most people don't have to think about that most of the time. If there's something that really comes up, Dan Rather or Walter Cronkite will tell you basically what's going on, and you can basically believe him. But obviously that's not the world we live in anymore, right? You go back again to the 1960s, and I kind of look at a lot of the subsequent history since the 1960s as kind of the result of the complete just annihilation and breakdown and delegitimization of the old WASP like elite that had been in control of the country for a long time.
Exactly.
Right? That this was like, that Vietnam and then the civil rights movement, that those two things just completely delegitimized that class. And so they lost their cohesiveness, they lost their political and sort of economic power. Obviously, if you were to do like an economic survey, they probably still have most of the money, but there's no organization or cohesiveness or anything like that. The WASP power structure fell apart in the late 1960s. And you ask yourself, well, then who is the power structure? And the answer is it's been basically an open field since then. And I think, an open field when it comes to that kind of thing can be good. It leads to a tremendous amount of cultural creativity, leads to a really dynamic culture in a lot of ways, but it also, opens the door to chaos a little bit.
Do you mind a crazy digression?
No, not at all. That's all I do in my podcast is go on long digressions. So.
Which is why they sometimes go 5 or 6 hours, right? The best podcasts are the longest ones, by the way. Everyone knows that. I'm serious. You mentioned James Forrestal, and this kind of connects to your work on Israel-Palestine. You know where I'm going with this? So you said he went crazy. And now, for people who don't know, hold on. Let me tell people like what the story is. So there's this amazing. I'm writing about it in my book now. Or I've actually already written.
I've got a book about his assassination back here on my shelf.
That's what I'm saying. That's where I'm going. Yeah. So for people who don't know, James Forrestal, he was he was one of the top
Secretary of Defense.
Defense, yeah. He was defense in Truman's cabinet, and he was half of Truman's cabinet opposed the recognition of Israel. Half. Big names, including General Marshall of all people. But Forrestal was the real leader of the anti-Israel faction inside the Truman cabinet. And there was a fierce debate about this. And of course, eventually Truman went with the pro-Israel side. But Forrestal was the leader of this and made some very powerful arguments. One, which just really always resonates with me. He said, I forget the number, but it was something like, he said something like, there are 65 million Arabs and, in that area, and we want to go to war with all of them if we establish this state there and support it. Well, James Forrestal, shortly thereafter, a matter of years, I believe, was admitted to Walter Reed Hospital, and then fell out the window and died.
Yeah.
And now, so people have been speculating ever since then that perhaps some people who were sympathetic to Israel had something to do with him falling out of that window at Walter Reed Hospital. Now, I don't know. I mean, things like this, I'd take skeptically, but yeah.
One thing that, I'll put it this way, like the Zionists at that time were certainly not beyond that. Some of the Zionist terrorist groups were,
that's right.
They were sending mail bombs to the British Prime Minister and other cabinet members. They actually, according to a book that was written by the head of the White House mailroom through 6 presidents, he wrote a book about his experiences just in that role. And he said that they sent mail bombs to Truman, and then Truman's daughter in her memoir confirmed that. Because Truman was wavering as well. Truman's a guy who, he was sort of put in place to be the vice president because nobody really thought too much about him, and Roosevelt obviously was running the show, and then this guy ends up in charge. And but he gets there and he's got very mixed feelings on the Israel thing. His cabinet is divided on it. And, it's one of those just funny historical wrinkles. Like sometimes things that are total chance end up being a big deal as time goes on and unfolds. That really he recognized Israel and moved us in that direction because as he was approaching the 1948 election, he needed New York, and the New York Jews basically told him that you need to recognize Israel or you're going to have a problem here.
This is correct.
And that's I guess that's one of the factors that comes into play when you have an open democratic political system. Is you have to deal with things like that.
It's a fascinating story. Digression, although it does lead into my next question. I want to get into your work on Israel-Palestine and that podcast, which really launched you. And again, I heard from so many people about how good it was. People are huge fans of that. What is the angle or angles you take in that podcast that are different? Like, why did you feel, because of course this story has been told 10 zillion times from all sides, right? How on earth did you think you could make an original contribution to this story?
Just ignorance, naivety, and hubris, I think.
The best combination.
Yeah. If I would have known kind of what I was getting myself into at the beginning, I probably wouldn't have ended up doing it. So it's a good argument for just closing your eyes and jumping into the deep end. But actually, the reason that I did it was sometime around maybe 2012 or so. Wow. I was dating a Palestinian girl. And her parents did not approve of that, but we kept it on the down low. And I would talk to her about it. Now, at the time, I had just a basic American understanding of Israel-Palestine, right? A little more nuanced than that, maybe, but essentially Israel good, Arab terrorists bad, that just that kind of thing. And the Jews had reclaimed their homeland in the 40s, and so on, just the basic American idea. And I start talking to her about it, and she is just laying waste to me. And I'm realizing that, I don't know anything about this. And so I got curious and I started reading. And as I started reading, I was like, wow, like this is not at all. This is just much different than what I've been taught or led to understand. And so for 3 years, maybe 4 years, that's all I did was read that stuff. I read over. I have like a written bibliography somewhere. People have been asking me to type it up, but it would take forever because I read over 80 books. Wow. I read well over 1,500, I think, at the last count, just articles and academic essays and diaries and things like that. I read everything I could find. Wow. And I did that for several years. And one of the interesting experiences I actually had, and this is like, I try not to think about this sometimes because it does like become a little bit paralyzing, is, I started the first episode of the first podcast after I had read like 6 books maybe. And I start working on it, and it takes a long time. And so by the time I get up to where I think I'm getting, ready to put the finishing touches on it, it's been quite a while, and I've read a lot more by the time I got there. And so then I go back to the beginning and I'm reading it, and I realized that it's not even remotely enough to say that I didn't know what I was talking about. Like it's as if I was being actively ignorant. I mean, it was just so bad. And I was like, oh my goodness. So I was like, I just have to wait right now and put this aside and not do anything until I actually get a firm enough base. And then, but so the thing is like when I think about that, 6 books on one topic, and not even the entire history of Israel. My series only goes up to 1948 and the foundation of the state. I've read 6 books on that topic, and I had no idea what I was talking about. And then I thought about all the other topics that I've read 1 book on, and I'll just expound upon like I know what I'm talking about,
But what did you find that was different than the standard narrative? I mean, what was the angle? Why were people so turned on by this podcast of yours, do you think?
Well, I think, similarly to the one of the things I try to do in all my podcasts, whether it's the Israel-Palestine one, whether it's the episode I did on the My Lai massacre, or the Jim Jones one, where you're dealing with like a mass murdering psychotic cult leader. I don't even allow myself to start working on something until I feel like I can see where everybody involved in the story is coming from, at least on some level, right? So like even Jim Jones, like I got myself to the point with that topic that I could understand why people would join that organization, why they would be loyal to it, why they would find so much worth devoting themselves to in this crazy cult that led to the suicides of 900 people, most of them Black. And I really put the work in to try to do that with the Israel-Palestine side, where I really tried to see things as much as possible from the perspective of the Zionists, from the perspective of the Arabs, and from the perspective of the British as well, because obviously they were a big player in it.
Right.
And to tell the story, really from all of their perspectives and treat it as a sort of historical tragedy, right, rather than a morality play.
Great.
That this is something where you go back to like the early days of Zionism, like modern political Zionism, in the early first decade of the 1900s, second decade, and so forth. And what you can't help but like admire what you're reading. I mean, these people are idealistic. Everything is about like, just sort of bringing back the traditions of our homeland and all of this kind of very lofty stuff. People who want to they recreated the Hebrew language from scratch. These people were just like very devoted to this and in a very idealistic and beautiful way. But then they get in there, obviously, into Palestine, and they find out that there are other people who live there who also love that place and have their own history there and whatever. And so it's the story of idealism running into the rocks of reality and breaking apart once it hits those, And so it's this steady story of like, it starts out with this idealistic, movement that as time goes on, I kind of go through the different inflection points until by the time you get up to the 1940s, instead of a bunch of idealistic people coming in, they're like importing straight up like fascist organizations from Poland to come in, and they're going out and doing massacres at Deir Yassin and leaving bombs in marketplaces, all the kind of stuff that we associate with Hamas and so forth. Now the Zionists were doing to the Arabs back then. And it's and again, like, I really tried to get into like how something like that escalates. How is it that you go from like, and why is it that when you get into situations like that, it's so hard to de-escalate? If you think about, like, you remember in the 1990s when they were working on the Oslo Accords. Yeah. And you've got Bill Clinton and Arafat and prime ministers meeting, and which they're actually making a lot of progress. The Camp David Accords, they're making, or rather Oslo Accords, they're making some progress. And then what happens? Hamas goes and blows up a couple bombs specifically to derail that process. And then, of course, a Jewish terrorist assassinated Yitzhak Rabin, the prime minister. Right. Now, in a perfect world, Hamas would blow up those buses. The Zionist terrorists would kill Yitzhak Rabin, and everybody would say, see, this is exactly why we need to fix this. But in reality, that's just not apparently how it ever works. It's, and it's understandable, right? Like if that's your mother on that bus that got blown up, or if that's your kid or nephew or something who got hit with that Israeli drone strike, like you do not want to hear anything other than revenge. And this is the escalation that things take. To go back to the 1960s, you think about that transition that took place from the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and Martin Luther King and Ralph Abernathy and these types transitioning in through like Huey Newton and the Black Panthers until you get to the Black Liberation Army and the Symbionese Liberation Army, who are just on the warpath. And how does that happen? Well, it happens because you can only watch your people get abused or get hit so often before the young men, mostly on your side, want to go do something about it, or at least some of them do. And so some of them go do it, and now you've got the same thing going on over there. And some of one of those guys, even if 80% of both sides are like, everybody calm down, somebody's going to do something, and now it's not 80%, now it's 60%, and then it goes back and forth, and now pretty soon I saw this happen in Israel. For my DoD job, I would go to Israel all the time, work with them on their IDF on their air defense systems. And so I would go there frequently from the mid 2000s or so up until about 2017 or 18. And over that period of time, especially after the failed war against Hezbollah in 2006, I would be over there for long periods of time. I would talk to people, IDF people, hotel people, waitresses, whatever. And there was just no mistaking I guess you would call it like a rightward turn, but really it's more of what people were becoming, their hearts are becoming very hardened to the Palestinian problem. And it changed dramatically over the course of those years. And, that's something that's just very interesting to me, is like how these ideas, once they run into resistance in reality, tend to splinter apart and become hostile and escalate. And that's the angle I took with Israel, is try to understand, like, how did this happen? Not who's right or who's wrong. Like, how did it actually happen? Why did these people do what they did? And try to make it make sense.
Okay. Yeah. I think I really like that. And I think that my take on it, my meta take, I guess you could call it, I think maps onto yours. Let me try this though. First of all, I love that you approach it. You immediately throw out the morality play, right? Because that's how everybody tells it. Everybody on either side, on any side, right? You're either it's Israel good or it's Palestinians good, and the other side's evil, and that's just both sides all the time. It's nauseating. To call it a tragedy, I like that. It's not exactly how I would phrase it. Maybe the word, I wouldn't use that, but I certainly prefer that, because I do think the logic of Zionism is tragic. And for me, that is why they're killing each other in the streets. That is why there's a wall around that country. That is why Gaza is an open air prison, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Not because Jews and Zionists are evil, as some Palestinians would tell you. It's because, to me, the logic of Zionism requires that. Because if you're, as James Forrestal predicted, if you're going to establish a country with maybe 500,000 Jews in it in the middle of an ocean of 65 million Arabs, unless all of a sudden those Arabs stop caring about where they've lived and where their ancestors have lived for centuries and millennia, there's going to be problems. There's going to be big problems. And it requires the displacement. To have a Jewish state in an Arab world requires displacement of people. And of course, we argue endlessly about who displaced whom and how it was displaced, and did people actually leave voluntarily or were they forced out? But to have a Jewish state, state with a majority Jewish population, means you have to kick some people out or keep some people out, meaning Arabs, non-Jews. It is by definition, an apartheid state. I don't know why that's even controversial to say. Now, what you could say is that that's a good and necessary thing, given the history of the Jews being a stateless people, and of course, the Holocaust, right? But I've always said, and my mother's Jewish, my son is Jewish, I was married, whatever, blah, blah, blah. I care about Jewish lives, actually. I know a handful of Palestinians. I have virtually no connection to Palestinians, but I have a whole lot of connections to Jews, American and Israeli. I have known many Israeli Jews too. They, to me, both American Jews, including me and my son, and certainly the Israeli Jews, are less safe because of the existence of Israel. Because the existence of Israel is a thorn in the heart, the side, wherever you want to say it, of many people who live there, and many of their descendants who have lived there since, who were displaced and now live in these open air prisons or worse, right? So it seems to me, it's like to have and maintain a Jewish state requires that kind of apartheid system. You must exclude. I understand there are Arab Israeli citizens. I get it. I know, but they must always be a minority. Otherwise, Israel ceases to exist as a Jewish state. So they have to have controls. They have to, based on nothing but ethnicity, religion, race, whatever you want to call it, this gross superstitious stuff. So it's the logic of Zionism, which I agree with you originally. Like, it is beautiful, a stateless people, especially at the turn of the century when Herzl was doing his thing, right? A stateless people who have been oppressed from this country to that country to finally have a homeland. Great idea. How about this instead? Do it in Argentina, which they originally thought about, right?
Yeah, they thought about a lot of places,
Or a lot of places. If they had gone to Argentina, like up in the mountains in Argentina, I think they would have had a lot less conflict. And then they happen to choose a place right next to where all the oil is. When they chose a place where all the oil is, forget about it. You're guaranteed eternal war, which is exactly what James Forrestal predicted. He said, we will have eternal war. So did George Marshall. Eternal war if we recognize the state of Israel, and that is what we have gotten so far. How does that jive with you?
Yeah, I think the logic of Zionism itself, is just as an ethno-nationalist project, is
right.
You're certainly got a point there. And then there's also just historical circumstance, where you do wonder if it could have gone another way if things had broken in a certain direction. Like, if you look at the Princeton professor of like Russian and Soviet history, Stephen Kotkin, he's in the middle of a fantastic 3-volume biography of Stalin. And he talks about the early Soviet Union and how, I think he was, when did I hear this? Maybe it was when he was in a conversation with Zizek about Stalin. And they were talking about things that happened post-revolution, like in the 30s and the 40s and on up. Why did it get so bad? Like, why did millions of people have to die? Part of it is the logic of communism. Mm-hmm. Part of it is, that this is just, this is how it's going to work, But part of it also is that what they did to take power and establish power, like during the Russian Civil War, it was so brutal, and so many things were done that it created so many enemies that every person in the government had blood on their hands, which means that if somebody wants to, like if you fall out of favor, you can be accused of something and fed up to the lions. And so it created this sort of cycle of violence and paranoia that nobody was really able to control. It was something that was like self-fulfilling at that point because of the brutal way in which it started. And then when you look at Israel and Palestine, I mean, I don't think there's any argument about the definition here. 750,000 or so Palestinians were ethnically cleansed from Palestine in 1948. People can say, well, they left voluntarily, but those are people who are getting out of the way of a war zone. And so they leave temporarily, and international law, that everybody agrees to, says that people flee a war zone, they can come back to their homes. But that's not what happened. Those people were kept out, and their homes were very often just given to Jewish refugees and immigrants who were coming in.
Right.
They were inheriting houses with food still in the fridge. And, this is something like you go after Arafat cut a deal in the 1990s. He flew back to Palestine, and waiting for him there on the tarmac when his plane landed were a bunch of old Palestinian grandmothers. And they were throwing these little metal objects at him and cursing at him. And those little metal objects were their keys to their old houses that had been taken from them. They had kept them that long, hoping to go back to their houses. And so, Christopher Hitchens has a great metaphor that he used for the Israel-Palestine situation. Is he said, okay, look, if somebody's on a second or third floor building and that building's on fire, and the building in this case is Europe and the Russian Empire for the Jews in the 18th and 19th centuries and 20th century, and you jump out of the window and you land on somebody and they cushion your fall. It's like, okay, like we can understand how that happened and everything, but now you got to get up, you got to get off the guy. But what happens? You remember when you were like a kid and you're holding down your little brother or cousin or something and like messing with him, and he starts to go crazy, and you're like, okay, I'm going to let you up, but you have to promise not to hit me or whatever. And he says, screw you, just let me up. And you're like, all right, well, I can't let you up then.
Well,
and it's like kind of that situation,
Well, but I mean, okay, so if World War II and the Holocaust is the burning building, right?
And the pogroms and so forth. I mean, going back even before that. Yeah.
The whole history of oppression of Jews. I'm saying that they had a choice of where to jump.
Yeah, and the real reason that they didn't do it is it purely a marketing thing, really. I mean, it was just they just didn't believe that they could get enough Jews around the world excited enough to leave France, right, or something like that, to go to the Uganda highlands. Or Ho Chi Minh met Herzl in France, actually, or not Herzl. He met Chaim Weizmann in France while he was there, and he said, after we take Vietnam, you can have this section of the Vietnamese highlands. And he told them no. And there was talk about like the southern coast of Alaska up there, cutting out a little strip, Argentina.
Well, and then
Madagascar.
well, I was going to say Madagascar. I mean, the best story is Madagascar, which started
Yeah.
where? Which started with the Nazis. The
Mhm.
Nazis were actively working, and in fact, they did move some Jews to Madagascar, but they moved a whole lot of Jews to Palestine, and they were
Yeah.
scouting it out. Yeah, so a very fascinating untold story. Yeah. So what is? I know this is maybe you don't want to answer this, but like, what is your political position now on the Israel-Palestine conflict? Like, what is it? Where do you stand?
In despair.
Yeah.
I just,
Yeah.
yeah. I don't, I just,
Yeah.
I've tried and tried, and I look into the future and I do not see how this goes anywhere good.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, people hate each other more
Mm-hmm.
than they ever have.
Mm-hmm.
But more than that, like you look at the demographic arrangement of the West Bank and Gaza and southern Israel right now, and you say, how would you, like, let's say that we came up with a solution. Now, it's a two-state solution everybody's been talking about for so long, and therefore, the Palestinians are going to have their little statelet. And so you look at the actual demographic distribution, and it looks like the gerrymandered districts of American like electoral system. It's like, if you were to do that, you would either have a bunch of Jews living in the Palestinian state and a bunch of Palestinians living in the Jewish state, or hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people would have to be transferred. You have to have a population transfer, which we used to do things like that.
Mm-hmm.
But, when you look at like the colonization of the West Bank by the Israeli settlers, this is something that's done in a very, very aggressive and purposeful manner, right? We talk about these things as settlements and neighborhoods and so forth, but like when you look at what happens, it's just very strategic. Like they'll put, it was like here's a good example. This is there's a million examples like this, but this is just one. There was a hill. Down the hill is a Palestinian village. They're kind of in the valley, and so they put the Israelis put a cell phone tower up there for some settlers that were like off in another area.
Mm-hmm.
Well, they say, well, there's this piece of infrastructure now, and we have to defend it. We have to protect it from like possible acts of terrorism or whatever. So we're going to put some military contractors and security people up there, and they need housing. Well, now they also need water and electricity and other things. And now, well, they actually need like support. We need to put a store there for them so they can buy things. And pretty soon that hilltop becomes a whole community because a cell phone tower was built there. And then what do? Like things start happening, like all of the waste from the community up there is running down into the Palestinian village down below. That upsets those people. So they start going up there and like vandalizing the orchard or something. And eventually, once that starts happening, then the Israeli military comes in and says, what's this? You have a problem with this Palestinian village? They're vandalizing your stuff, or starting fights with your men or whatever. Well, we're going to go in there and clean out that village.
Right.
And that's how this whole process has proceeded over decades at this point. The unfortunate thing is, if you look at, again, the distribution of these people, I mean, there's so many Israelis in such a disparate like area in the West Bank, and these are very committed people. Like the people who live out there are very usually religious. They're very hardcore. And every time the Israeli government has ever tried to come in and say, this settlement, we need to get it out of here. It's either too dangerous and we can't defend it, or we're getting too much pressure from the international community. They got to bring in the Israeli military because the people riot.
Yep.
And that's like a single little community. If they were to try to do that with large areas, like it's just not going to happen. It's not politically feasible in the Israeli democracy for that to happen, right?
Yeah.
You would need an authoritarian government in Israel, kind of like ironically, you would need an authoritarian government in order to do the compassionate thing for the Palestinians.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Kind of only Nixon could go to China sort of thing.
Right. There's an amazing documentary. I'm not sure if it's on YouTube only or PBS. It might be a PBS thing. Might be a frontline thing about I think they call them the hill kids, the settler kids in the hills, who live in the contested areas, the things, places that have recently been settled. Right. So there's a lot of conflict. And it's not really different from Bloods and Crips in LA in the 1980s. I mean, these are people who are killing babies and stuff and setting houses on fire with families inside of them, going both ways. But I mean, this is some hardcore stuff. I mean, you talk about the brutality of settler colonialism. Boy, you see it right there. And we're talking about teenagers. And these are, by the way, these are the people who for like Likudniks, for the conservatives in Israel, are no good. It's like they're like the Ku Klux Klan is to the Republican Party here, right? But yeah, so there's that. So here's my position. My position is similar to yours, which is despair. My position politically is this: I do not want to support it. I do not want to pay for it. If people in Israel want to continue to try to live in a sea of Arabs, as James Forrestal said, good luck to them. And I mean that. I really mean that. But I think it's a bad idea for them. I think it's a bad idea for me and all of my Jewish family and friends. I think it makes us less safe. And I sure as hell don't want to spend any of my money on it, which I do. I'm forced to. So that's the movement I think we should make, is to say, morally support anybody who wants to establish, an independent sovereign state. Good luck to you. But to me, it's self-destructive for Jews. I'm not even talking about what it does to Palestinians. I think it's self-destructive for Jews. Now, of course, I know a lot of Jews who live in Tel Aviv and they basically live like Europeans and everything's groovy and they make nice television shows and they have movie stars who are hot and all that. Fine, but they also live in a constant state of war.
Yeah.
And the constant state of war creates particular personality. And I think that's why Israelis have that particular personality. It's not because they're evil, but because they know that stuff can always blow up.
It's living in a constant state of war, but also, your mind has to, like imagine you're on your way to church on Sunday, you're driving to church, and as you're going there, you're just passing like masses of desperate homeless people, and you're just sort of driving past them on your way to church, right? Mm-hmm. For you to be able to do that, to be able to just pass by those people and feel nothing about it, and still think of yourself as a human being, you gotta have a mechanism that's taking care of that in your mind. And so you have Israelis like in Tel Aviv who, like, less than an hour away are these stateless refugees whose kids are growing up in absolute squalor, who are subjected to routine mass violence by the Israeli military. I mean, and so in order to live that way all the time, like you said, in Tel Aviv, it's a beautiful city. I mean, the Israelis, they deserve a lot of credit for the country that they've built. I mean, it's an amazing project that they've done. That Palestinian girl I was talking about, I asked her one time, because she's hardcore, obviously. And I asked her, all right, well, if you had to, if America deported you, said you're going to some country in the Middle East to live, where do you want to live? She said, Israel, so there's that. And they deserve some credit for that. I mean, out of nothing, they built a vibrant, internally tolerant society, right? But it's it's like that Ursula Le Guin story, short story, The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas, where, she starts off and she talks about, she sort of describes this town. It's like a seaside town. Everything's beautiful. All the houses are clean. The walkways are swept. The children are happy and healthy. The marriages and relationships are all groovy. Like, everything's great. But in the center of town, there's this building. And in the basement of that building is a room. And anybody can go there and take a look. Not everybody does, not very often. You go down and you open the door and you look, and there's a small child in there that is about like maybe 10 years old, but it looks about 6 because it's so malnourished and it's beaten and it's filthy, and it can't even speak because it's just been down there being abused for its entire existence. It just sort of mumbles and drools on itself, and it's starved and abused. And people will come down, and residents of the town, and they can go look at this child, and everybody knows it's there. This is not a secret. And somehow, some way, like in their minds, they don't know exactly like the mechanism, how it works, but they know that all their happiness, everything that works up here, everything that's so beautiful and pristine and so forth, that somehow that child has to be there for all of this to work.
Wow.
And you can, this is something where you can have like think about like slavery or Jim Crow, for example. Like, there's many like examples of this where there's something down at the core, a core abuse, a core, like a base crime that's down there at the bottom of something that really does flower into something tremendous and beautiful. But it's I guess like my position on it, like if you were gonna just force me to sort of come up with one, is I think the 2-state solution is dead. I don't think that's remotely on the table. And I think that there should be massive, massive international pressure on Israel, Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, and Egypt to arrive at a settlement that makes all of those people citizens of those various countries. I just think that, you got to figure the occupation of the West Bank started in 1967, and that's 55 years ago. So these people have been under military occupation for 55 years after only having, the state of Israel had only been around for 19 years at that point.
Right.
So this is the overwhelming chunk of Israeli history that they have had full control over these people, but that those people have had no rights.
Right.
And it's, you have like other groups like the Kurds, say in Iraq or Syria, who are a large group of stateless people. But those people are at least citizens of those countries. And, sometimes that doesn't mean a lot when Saddam Hussein wants to gas you or something, but at least on some level of like international law, these are not stateless people. They technically are citizens with rights. The Palestinians, it's this massive group of millions of people. You go to Gaza, the average age of people in Gaza is 16 years old.
What?
Yeah. Wow. I mean, this is a bunch of kids, running around in this horrible situation.
Wow.
And these are stateless people with no political rights, no state that's sort of looking after their interests in a hostile state. You go down to like Gaza, and I've gone down and seen these things. There's a wall down there around Gaza, and there are remote controlled machine guns on the wall pointing inward, right?
Shit.
And they're controlled remotely from about 15 miles away from people. These things have cameras on them. And, this is a population of 3.5 million people where the average age is 15, 16 years old, and they're contained by a wall with remote control machine guns on it.
Jesus Christ.
And it's, if you're a couple of years ago when this was just one of the most tragic recent things that really happened. You remember a couple of years ago when in Gaza, a lot of the activists, and Hamas was a part of this, they kind of finally, they took the advice of people like me, all the Western activists who are pro-Palestine, who want to see this situation resolved. They finally took the advice, which was always like, look, guys, bombing stuff, school buses is not getting anywhere. In fact, it's ruining your movement. It's done it for a long time. What you guys really need to do is something like the Green March in Spanish Morocco back in the 60s. It's just drop your weapons and just walk to the border and be like, we're just going to walk past you guys. And like, that will sort of delegitimize the system.
Wow.
And the Spanish soldiers refused to fire on the Green March people in Morocco. The Israelis had snipers shoot some 6,000 or 7,000 people. And many of them, there are videos of them shooting people in wheelchairs, shooting kids. The Israeli soldiers at the beginning of it had orders to fire at anybody who came within 300 yards of the fence. It was later reduced to 100 yards, but still. And so like, when I talk to people about like, what do I want, like, as far as our relationship to Israel, which is the primary thing that I'm concerned with as an American, is I would just like it if they would be held to the same standard that we would hold our own military to. Okay. If our soldiers over in Iraq or Afghanistan had a bunch of people in a fenced area, say at Abu Ghraib prison or something like that, and those people were protesting and like approaching the fence, and our soldiers got orders to shoot anybody who came within 300 yards of that fence, I would want everybody associated with that decision thrown in prison. And they would be thrown in prison, I think, in America, like, and it's it's a desperate situation. I mean, it really is a horrible situation. I mean, Gaza is the most overcrowded area on the planet. The Israelis control what supplies they get. And after the 2014 war, they bombed their only water treatment plant. It took a long time to get that fixed because they wouldn't allow concrete to come in large enough numbers because they said it could be used to build tunnels. They even have the coast there. They're only allowed to go a certain number of miles off the coast to do things like fishing and so forth. But that range that they're allowed to go out is before the continental shelf drops off, and so that's where all the fish kind of really are, and so they're not allowed to access that. It's patrolled by Israeli craft, and so this is an open air prison camp.
Prison.
That's what Gaza is. It's an open air prison camp.
And am I right? Israelis control the power grid, so they can turn off the lights anytime they want to.
Yeah, that's right.
Which they do often, right? They just turn off the lights.
Yeah.
Oh my God! So you've been to Gaza?
I've been outside of it. I've never gone into Gaza. No,
I'd like.
I've been
I'd
to
like
the West Bank. I've been to Ramallah and some of the Hebron, some of the other areas, but I've only been down to the fence in Gaza.
I'd like to go to Gaza sometime if it's safe. I don't know, but I'd really like.
You
to
can
see
go
this.
there. Yeah,
Can
you can go there. Yeah.
Oh my goodness, God damn it. Okay, yeah, it's hard to. I'm watching Fauda. Have you seen Fauda, the TV show?
I haven't, but everybody tells me I should watch it.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just curious. For those who know Israel, I've never been there. You know how it feels authentic, and there's a whole sort of series of episodes set in Gaza, which are pretty intense, and I'm just curious about that. But it's well done. So okay, now you work with Jocko Willink, and what you've just been saying about Israel Palestine, is certainly counter to the foreign policy establishment's line on Israel Palestine that he worked for many, many years as a Navy SEAL commander. I'm just curious, and I really don't follow Jocko that much. I've only seen him occasionally on Fox News say things like we need to kill the terrorists, which okay, but I know he's a thinker, and he's done hundreds of podcasts, and I know he's worked with you extensively. So I just don't know, but I'm just curious, sort of, since you've been working with him, have you seen his ideas about politics, foreign policy, war, the Middle East change, or how have they changed, or what's your effect been on him?
I wouldn't want to take too much credit for that, but sure. He's very open-minded. Like Jocko comes across obviously as very much just a sort of G.I. Joe down the line kind of gung-ho action figure type. Mm-hmm. He's extremely open-minded, and cool. We're bringing Scott Horton on in a week to come do an episode with us, and we'll talk about all this stuff. And he's reading Scott's book right now. I gave it to him, and he's reading that book. And he's very open to all that kind of stuff. When we did our episodes on the unraveling episodes on the Iraq War, he obviously is a guy who commanded men over there, who lost friends over there, and so forth. And that's going to give you a certain amount of attachment to the mission. It's really, really hard to believe that that not just your friends, but men under your command were killed for something that was a bad idea, right? And yet, even then, like he, in our conversations about it, like he understands, that he still has this idea that like America ought to be a force for good in the world. And if there's somebody, he was on a ship, actually, a troop carrying ship off the coast of Africa while the Rwandan genocide was going on, waiting for the word to go in there and like help out, and they never got that word. And so that kind of stuff is formative for him, that there's this sort of Samantha Power responsibility to protect kind of thing. He's a protector. That's how his mind works. As far as the Israel stuff, I guess the best way I can tell you is we did an episode on Israel once, and we threw it away because it didn't go real well.
Why? What happened?
Honestly, it was mostly my fault. I kind of we were going to do an episode. I think we were kind of starting with the 67 war, and then we were kind of branching out from there. And I didn't really prepare for it because I was just like, I know this topic like the back of my hand. So normally I go through and I've got my notes, I got everything, and I've been like really pounding it into my head. I didn't do any of that. And I learned a lesson that day, which is even if it's something well, you have to prepare for the episode, because otherwise what happens is you go in there and you start getting emotional and whatever. And I was like going pretty hard. Yeah. Okay. And, it's one of those topics that, it's natural that it brings out emotions on all sides, because I don't want to downplay the fact that, the Israelis, first of all, like the people who are there now and who've been there for the last few decades, these aren't the people who took over Palestine, right? These are their parents and grandparents. That's right. They were just born there. This is their home. That's all they know. That's right. And those people too have suffered tremendously. That's right. Not in such like mass numbers, it's not the whole population. That's right. But it's a small country. And if you go through Israel, what you find and talk to people, you probably have had this experience, is at the very least, everybody knows somebody who who has been like at least in proximity to an attack, you know. And when you go back, especially in the dark years, you know, in the 70s and 80s, you know, you read about some of the just absolutely savage mass murders that took place, not just suicide bombs on buses, but where they capture a family and torture and kill them and stuff. And it's like, you know, it's this is one of the things, like when I did the series, made it in a way like kind of easy. I really focused on like, okay, honestly, just be honest. Like I can have this idea, this like set of ideas about like the shape of the overall conflict and who's responsible for what and which side has like sort of committed maybe the greater injustice on the other. I can have all those opinions, but if I ask myself, if I was an Israeli, if I was over there and I lived in Tel Aviv and I had to walk through the streets, which you do in Haifa and Tel Aviv and these other places, and you still see on buildings, a lot of places are charred because they haven't cleaned it up because a bomb went off there. Or if somebody I knew had been killed or something, how, like realistically, how would I feel about this? And I give the same answer that like when I talking about the 1960s, if I was a young black dude in 1968, I can promise you I would be a Black Panther, not somebody who was putting on a suit and like following Martin Luther King, just because I can totally understand like that mentality and like what that would do to you. You can only take so much. But unfortunately, that's something that applies to both sides, you know, and in a conflict that's been this drawn out and this bitter, you know, anybody who wants a reason to hate the other side is going to find plenty. And, you know, it's really hard for an outsider to like have it. Like, I don't tell Israelis they shouldn't hate Palestinians. I don't tell Palestinians they shouldn't hate Israelis, you know, because I try to be self-aware enough to know that, you know, I don't have the context for that and that I would be vulnerable to that as well.
Yeah. Why did you join the Navy?
You know, I was, I guess, like I said, I had family, older family that had been in the military. My grandfather had retired from the Navy. I was in school on a wrestling scholarship and then got hurt. And so that went away. And I kind of just hadn't really decided what I wanted to do, you know, where I wanted to major exactly. And I had given a lot of thought to joining up in the Navy after I got finished anyway. And so I just went ahead and joined the Navy. Yeah.
Did you, I'm wondering, you know, I have Jocko's savior complex too. I don't enact it through military service, but that's the classic way to do it. But it's very much a part of me. I'm always trying to save people in various ways. One of the
things that I have seen develop in him, like just in recent years, you know, not because of things that I've said to him, but just because of the shape of events, how things have turned out, is I think he understands fairly well now that just because you maybe even intend to help somebody doesn't necessarily mean that that's going to happen. And in fact, you may make it much, much worse.
Yeah. So. No, I'm saying I'm very sympathetic to it.
Yeah.
I feel, and I'm asking if you have any of that in you too. I'm guessing you kind of do.
Yeah. Yeah, sure. On a personal level, as well as, you know, when I see stuff like, you know, foreign policy. I mean, I grew up really poor, like in ghettos in Southern Central California, going to schools that were pretty hardcore. And, you know, so early on, before I started wrestling and learned to fight and stuff, I knew what it was like to get bullied. You know, I lived in a broken home where there's just, you know, there's a lot of stuff going on that made me very sensitive to people who are powerless being persecuted by people who have power over them. You know, as I got older, it would, you know, I would use it as an excuse to take out some of my anger on people, you know, tell myself I was doing the right thing by beating up on a bully or something. But, you know, and again, I wouldn't say that was like all a positive impulse. Like some of it was just convenient target, but, so yeah, that's definitely in me. I mean, I'm very, it's just something like, you know, I really believe that, there are a few core things that are just cross-cultural and they go through different eras, that if you go to human beings, they're going to have like the same response to certain things. And people know injustice when they see it. You know, and what I mean is like, it's not that like every aspect or incident of injustice is going to be clear to people when they see it. But I should say, like, you know, when you see somebody with power picking on somebody without power, like there's, like growing up, right? There'd be times when I would see a bully picking on somebody or having a crowd surround somebody and they're all making fun of, this kid who can't defend himself. And sometimes I would step in and say something, at the very least, redirect some of that anger, toward me or something, but say something.
Mm-hmm.
Other times I didn't say anything because I just didn't want to get on the wrong side of these people, all the reasons that people wouldn't say something. And I can tell you that to this day, this was 30 years ago, 20, 25, 30 years ago. I remember those incidents like they were yesterday, the times that I didn't say anything. Mm-hmm. I think of them and I feel shame about them to this day. And and I think most people are probably that way. You can the way that you can defend against it is to identify with the aggressor and become one of the persecutors, and then that kind of pushes that outside. But because nobody really thinks that they're persecuting or scapegoating while they're doing it, they think that they're just dispensing justice or whatever.
See, I think from that example, the way you describe it, I that actually to me is a proof that there is no such thing as human nature on this. That the people go, the Milgram experiment, is one example. I mean, people, enjoyed, dishing out what they thought was punishment to the prisoners, and people there are sadists. We've talked about that earlier. I mean, I think that's why a lot of people become cops and soldiers. Not all, but I think many of them do, because that's a way to hurt people and get away with it for fun. And I think that a lot of times people love piling on the underdog, against the underdog. Look at Twitter. I mean, it happens all the time. I mean, happens
there's an
everywhere.
Impulse to persecute. There's an impulse to persecute.
Yeah.
There's no question about it. And there's also this, that's kind of the predatory impulse to persecute the weak or the different, right? But then also there's the herd animal side of it as well, which is the rest of us. Even if you're not the persecutor, there's this sort of herd animal sigh of relief when somebody other than you gets picked off.
Right.
When the lion gets another wildebeest, then the rest of you can all breathe the sigh of relief. And so there's this, kind of perverse, I don't know about pleasure, but like, for lack of a better word, this perverse pleasure in seeing somebody else being made a target.
This is a segue, I think, when we're talking about saviors or would-be saviors. I'm dying to talk to you about Jim Jones and People's Temple, partly because of my connection to it just geographically. And I knew a few people who were sort of around it back in the day, but just, a lot of people don't know anything about it. People who haven't heard your podcast, I think most people will not know anything about it. It went down in 1978. That's when it became well known. But why do you want to just tell the story and why did you, or actually I'd rather you start off by saying why you care and why you wanted to do a podcast about it. What was interesting?
Well, I started reading about it mainly just because it was a crazy cult story, right? That was kind of the thing that got me started reading about it. And as I started reading and learning about it, I realized that that's not the most interesting aspect of it at all. First, you said people don't know a lot about it. The first thing that almost nobody knows about it, unless they've read a book about it or listened to the podcast, is that 75% of those 900 something people that died out there were Black.
Yep. I know.
And, that's the first thing. When I see that, I'm like, how is that not the one thing that everybody knows about this story, right? Like if this was, if a group of people, 900 people went out in the jungle in South America and killed themselves, and it turned out that 75% of those people were first generation Mexican immigrants, that would be at the center of the story, right? And that would be the thing to figure out, okay, what happened here? What is going on? Why are these people joining this organization and devoting themselves to it? You have a situation where the first episode, I kind of started out as a prologue, and I told 3 stories. One, I started out with this article from 2006 from the Southern Poverty Law Center of all places, but it was a good article where they talk about how since the early 1990s in Los Angeles, a lot of those neighborhoods that everybody thinks of as Black neighborhoods from the early 90s and 1980s, Compton and so forth, that there's just been essentially an ethnic cleansing campaign that's been going on by the Latino gangs against the Black people that live there.
That's right.
And so, and I mean really violent.
That's right.
Up in Pomona, they had a gang up there that they estimated was responsible for 80 something random shootings of Black people in 3 years.
Wow.
in Boyle Heights back in, I think, like 94 it was. There was an apartment building that was firebombed because they wanted to get those black people out of there.
Yes.
And so this is going on.
This is by Latinos, so people know this is by Latinos, mostly Mexican gangs. Yes.
Yeah, if they were wearing white hoods, we'd send the 82nd Airborne after them. But,
right.
But it's one of those things that doesn't fit very neatly into any of our preconceived political boxes, and so it just gets really ignored. In LA, people know about it, but and I know you know about it. But and so I told that story, and then I backed up one generation, and I told the story of the crazy riot in Cicero in 1952, where a black family tried to move into a neighborhood, and the white residents first protested against it. But then when that didn't work, this was a middle-class black family, who they were the picture of like the people, if you were going to make this work, this would have been the people to make it work with. The father worked overtime to save up to buy his daughter a piano for piano lessons. I mean, this is a middle-class bourgeois black family. And the white people who were in the neighborhood there in Cicero, which is a suburb of Chicago, at first protested, and then they became violent. And it got to the point that they chased them out of the building. They tore the plumbing out of the walls, the wiring out of the walls. They broke the sinks, broke the toilets, and then eventually they just burned the building down. They rioted for several days. Hundreds of people were hurt and arrested. Right. And these are white people and white cops who are being injured and rioting. And so there's this just massive resistance. And then I go back one more generation, and now we're in the Jim Crow South. The famous lynching incident that took place in Georgia, where something like 16 people were lynched because this abusive white farmer was killed by one of the black people that he was beating up. And one of the people who was killed was this pregnant woman who they tied up to a tree upside down. They beat her. They set her on fire. They cut her baby out of her stomach and stomped on its skull when it hit the ground, and then set her body on fire. And so it's this horrible incident. And I framed it that way at the beginning because, you have slavery ends, you have Jim Crow, and you have incidents like that happening in the South. That's the situation black people are finding themselves in. The Great Migration kicks off during World War I, and they say, okay, we're gonna essentially, you got to think about, these are people who not only, this is the only area they had ever lived was the South, right? Up until 1914, when the Great Migration started, or 1917, really, when the Great Migration started, all of the big cities in the North and West that we think of as having black populations, Detroit, Baltimore, they had like 1%, 2% black populations, very small. Everybody was still down in the South, essentially working as sharecroppers for the same people that they had worked for as slaves before. And so the Great Migration kicks off, and these people get the gumption up to leave everything they've ever known, to leave like their rural living in the South and go move to like Chicago, right? And they leave this horribly abusive situation in the South. As they move into these places, there's incidents like the Cicero incident, tremendous resistance. Once they get to the North, it's not the promised land they think it is. And then all the way up to the present day, once, in places where they had established themselves, like in Los Angeles and other West Coast cities, now they're getting ethnically cleansed out of those places. And there's actually a reverse Great Migration happening right now. If you look at like black demographic trends, not just the black share, but actually absolute numbers of black people in like all the big West Coast cities and a lot of other cities are going down, and those people are moving back to the South.
I know, yeah.
It's like that midnight train to Georgia story,
Yeah, right.
And that's a horrible, horrible tragedy, that you have this enslaved population who leaves their sort of home area, goes and tries to make a life, faces great resistance when they get there. And now when you go there, the country is more segregated now than it actually was during Jim Crow. If you look at like the most segregated cities in the country, like 19 of the top 20 are all in the North and West.
Wow.
And, you have these ghettos in a lot of these cities that in a million different ways, their lives are way worse than they were under Jim Crow in the South, where at least they had community. At least they had this is where they live. They had, it's just,
they had businesses. They had businesses too.
Yeah, exactly. A parallel economy, all those things.
Yep.
And so I framed it with that at the beginning, to sort of set up like why is it that a bunch of black people who lived in Chicago, in Oakland and San Francisco would join an organization that, you can say what you want about the People's Temple. Yes, they were crazy. Yes, they were vindictive when you crossed them. All of the things that you say about them are true, but there's no doubt about the fact that the Black people, many of whom who were people who came from the Great Migration, they had a lot of like 70, 80-year-old people who lived half or more of their lives under Jim Crow in the South, that these people get there. And the white people who were in there, as crazy as a lot of them were, the one thing they were not was racist. And you would go in there and they treated you with dignity and respect. That's and right. friendliness, and they treated you like a brother or sister, and they really did.
That's right.
So I try to think of, like, for God's sake, you're a 75-year-old Black woman who spent most of her life in the Jim Crow South. You and your husband move out to Oakland. You live in one of those shitty neighborhoods next to the docks where all the the dock workers lived, and your neighborhood just over a period of time just degrades and becomes violent and horrible. Later, your husband eventually dies in the house that that he bought you, and you're there alone. And that's the life that you've known. And now you go into this place, you move into one of like People's Temples. That's what they, that's what they call themselves, the People's Temple. You move into one of their like community homes that they had, and the white parents are like dropping their kids off with you, and the kids are jumping up on your lap, white kids like hugging you and calling you grandma, and it's real. It was real. Try to imagine the impact that would have on people who lived in the society that we had back then, and it was tremendous, and you saw people sort of, with the younger people, they have people who were on drugs, who were criminals, who just their life was a disaster and it was headed nowhere good. And they joined the People's Temple, and that all changed. There was one story in there. It's just it's just the worst story, but like in a way. But there was this woman who was from Indianapolis, which is where Jim Jones kind of originally came from. He was from a small town in Indiana. He moved to Indianapolis, and that's where he started his church. And his kids, he had a son who was white. He had a son who was Black that he adopted and gave his own name, Jim Jones Jr. He had two Korean kids that he adopted from. They were Korean War orphans, kind of a rainbow family. And his kids knew this girl, Indiana, when they were in Indianapolis. And they were friends, and they were just, everybody was nice. So then Jim takes his church, and they move out to first Ukiah and then the Bay Area, and she's back there, and she tells her own story, which I share in the podcast. That she's a poor Black woman in Indianapolis, lives in the ghetto, and her life kind of takes shape, in accordance with her environment. She gets hooked on drugs. She gets mixed up with like a lot of guys who abuse her, who pimp her out. It's not a good life. She's addicted, she's depressed, she's suicidal, she's being abused by men, all these kind of things. She's like 21 years old, something, when Jim Jones is, he would take like busfuls, like whole caravans of buses. They would go out on tours around the country and speak at churches and do other events and stuff to try to recruit people. Well, they go back through Indianapolis, and she goes to this event, and because she knew, his kids when they were there. And she's talking to Jim Jones, and she just sort of, he asks like, how's your life been or whatever. And she says like, ups and downs, not so great, whatever, been better. And he says, oh, well, why don't you just hop on the bus and come with us back to California? It's great out there. And so she goes. And this woman, who, when they picked her up, her life, she was headed to an early grave, like a very, very near term early grave. And they got her out there, and they found out that this woman was actually like a musical prodigy. And so she becomes the conductor and the lead singer of the People's Temple's band, which is really good, actually, because they had like thousands of members from the Bay Area, from the Fillmore and stuff, and they were legit. Like, and she's the lead singer, like one of the main songwriters and musicians, and the kind of conductor of the band. And over the course, this was like, I think in 72 or 73 that they got her. And between then and 1978, this woman just blossoms into one of their best members. She's clean off drugs, just positive, happy. You can go watch video of her singing an Earth, Wind, and Fire song. That's the way, of the world. And it's just beautiful. And you can watch her up there, and she's happy, and she's free, and she's dancing. And her and all the rest of those people who experience that kind of change went off into the jungle with Jim Jones and they killed themselves, out of paranoia and political insanity. And, it was, and just because, when, you have an organizational structure, the thing that like makes a cult different from a religion, say, right, is that a cult, it closes you off from the rest of the world. It's all inward looking, and it's an us versus them. They try to separate you from your family, from friends, and they have their reasons, right? They think that like your family and your friends are the people who led you into that life that you wanted to escape, right? And so this is your family now, and you're going to focus on this. But once you are closed off enough from the rest of the world, that sort of mimetic process of self-socialization internal to the group can get really out of hand. In the same way that an individual person who's too isolated, can try to go out around normal people and find that now they're kind of pretty weird and nobody knows how to handle them, and they don't know how to deal with the rest of the world because they just haven't, they've been in their own head all the time. And so, it's a horrible, horrible tragedy, because like it's actually, there's a similar thing to the Israel-Palestine thing, where it started off incredibly idealistic. But then as you get into the 1960s, when as Malcolm X gets assassinated, as Martin Luther King gets assassinated, as all of the things that just build, people's patience falls apart, and they get more militant and more crazy. I mean, the most interesting thing about it, and I didn't know I was going to do this with the series until I actually started doing it, is that, Jim Jones started his first church in the mid 50s. So right about the time of like Brown versus Board of Education stuff. So he's right at the forefront. I mean, Jim Jones was a communist in college, right? So like say what you want about the communists, they were on the right side of the race relations stuff, and so he was plugged into that. FBI guys were coming to like question his mom at her workplace when he was in college because he had gone to like communist events and stuff, and so he was plugged into that very early. And so right around the time of like Brown versus Board of Education and the bus boycott and so forth, that's when he's starting his church. And at that time, there's no craziness. Like, he's a little weird. You can kind of see some signs that he's a little bit strange, but his movement, this is a solid social justice movement. And people who study Jim Jones say rightly that if in like 1962 or 63 or something, he'd just been hit by a bus, he would be remembered today as a great early civil rights leader. Rightfully so.
Yeah.
And what happened to him is the same thing that happened to the civil rights and anti-war movement, which is they just became progressively disillusioned and then more hostile through the 1960s, for good reason, by the way. I mean, when you like think about like the anti-war movement, right? You go back to like 1968, you got Eugene McCarthy and Hubert Humphrey who are running for the Democratic nomination, and you've got all these like anti-war hippie types who are like, okay, we're going to buy into the system. You had like the Clean for Gene movement, where all the hippies would shave their hair and cut off their beards and stuff and go out and be activists. Like they were in. They're like, okay, we're going to use the institutions, use the system here to end this war. Eugene McCarthy was obviously against the war, and the Democratic Party just straight up stole the nomination from Eugene McCarthy. Right? Like, there's no other way to look at that, is they just stole it. Now you think about it, you say, well, they stole this nomination from this candidate and gave it to this other guy. Well, that's politics or whatever. But you have to think about, like, this was the difference between, am I going to get sent to Vietnam to go kill people and die, or am I not? Right? Am I going to get sent there at gunpoint, like at threat of prison, if this guy gets elected, and not if this guy gets elected? So this is a life or death issue, and they just stole the nomination from him. And so at that point, the people say, we don't have any legitimate options like to redress our grievances here. Especially, so they go to protest what happened at the 1968 convention, and the Chicago police beat the shit out of them, right? And so they look at it and they're like, okay, there's all of the extremists, right? Because these people had existed before, the Weathermen and so forth. They existed before, but now everybody's listening to them, and they're like, yeah, you got a point. You're right. Maybe you're right that the system is just too, overwhelmingly corrupt. And then you have that with like the Black movement as well, right? The civil rights movement. it's like, the Black Power movement was contained by Martin Luther King's, basically by the gravity of his person and personality, like, because he was against the Black Power movement. He didn't want it to go in that militant, violent direction. And as long as he was around, just he commanded so much respect that he was able to keep a lid on that to a degree. But then he gets killed. And, I mean, we have, like, I don't know necessarily about all the conspiracy theories about it, but I do know that there are anecdotes of FBI agents jumping for joy when they heard about it.
Of course.
And so that, that happens. And then the Black people are like, I'm not listening to this nonviolent stuff anymore. I'm gonna listen to my Black Panther friend, and it's totally understandable why people would do that.
Right.
And that arc, starting from that idealistic early 50s time, and then going up through the 1960s with the war and the way the civil rights movement got radicalized, and then into the 1970s where you're in full psychosis mode with like the Symbionese Liberation Army and the family and some of these other groups. That is the trajectory, like moment by moment, of the Jonestown cult, People's Temple's cult. And so I was able to tell the story of this organization, but use it as a vehicle for kind of explaining the radicalization and destruction of the civil rights and anti-war movements, the left-wing movements of the 1960s and 70s. That's why it became so interesting to me.
Okay, so it's absolutely brilliant. I love your approach to it. I think you're missing just one thing though, which is that beginning in 1965, the war on drugs and the war on crime start. So Lyndon Baines, I
don't even address that. That's a good point.
And no one talks about this because it's Lyndon Baines Johnson's laws, right? And they want him just to be bad on Vietnam, but good on domestic policies. No, he started mass incarceration. He started the militarization of the police in 1965. It was 2 laws during that year that was passed by him. One is the war on drugs.
He's Lyndon Johnson, I can tell you, is at the very bottom of my list of presidents in the United States.
Yeah,
I think he was the greatest disaster of a president that I can think of.
Domestically, not just in Vietnam too. I'm saying, like, so he started locking up Black people and white people in large numbers beginning in 1965. By 1968, you have prison overcrowding, which results in things like the Attica uprising in 1971 in New York State, right? You have a prison that's overflowing with Black men who are locked up because of the Rockefeller drug laws, a progressive, by the way, Nelson Rockefeller. The drug laws are coming in, the mandatory minimums. This is the beginning of mass incarceration. And this is when People's Temple is taken off in the Bay Area, right here. San Quentin prison right across the bay from here is filling up with Black men and women too at exactly this time. These neighborhoods that I returned to just recently are getting decimated at this time. And this is when the Black Panthers are taking off for good reason, because the Oakland police at that point was still mostly white and mostly racist and mostly brutal. So
people really do need to understand the police were off the freaking hook back then. It was a paramilitary force that, they engaged in reprisals. People need to be clear on that. I know your audience is, but that's something that, the fact that like I kind of, like you said, some people call me a fascist, others call me a communist, but you go like online, like my Twitter following stuff is mostly a lot of conservatives, just because I had that viral thread that Tucker Carlson and Trump mentioned. But I kind of look at that as like, I have a certain responsibility, right? To like, you've got these like normie conservatives in America right now, people who were pro-Iraq war, not just because they trusted the government, basically, right? These are people who basically bought in, they're normies. I've got like these people here who are of that mentality, and we have a very unique like historical opportunity right now, because those, like, if I were to tell you 10 years ago, hey, in 10 years, the standard thing on the right is going to be fuck the CIA, fuck the FBI, anti-war, like, starting to like open up to like, to economic policies to like take care of the poor and working classes. You'd have been like,
I know, amazing.
If I would have said, no, this is going to happen, you would say, if that happened, then the whole country's changed. Like everything is different. Like that's that.
And
I
guess
can't
what?
believe like something. And it did happen. Unfortunately, what I didn't think of at the time was that they were going to convince most Democrats to become pro-war and hate the working class and all those kind of things.
It's the Democrats returning to their roots, Darryl. It's that they are the war-making party of the 20th century. People forget that. All the wars of the 20th century, except for Iraq, was them.
Yeah,
Man, this has been a blast, and I would really like to do this again with you
it
sometime.
went by so fast. Like, yeah, we didn't even get into Ukraine or anything like that. We can
No.
totally do this again, for sure.
Please, man. I mean, you're just the stuff you're interested in is just like right in my wheelhouse, and I love it. And your angles on it are new and fresh, and they make me think. So it's just been a super pleasure. And let's please do it again.
No doubt. Yeah, and let's get you down to San Diego to do an unraveling episode with us.
Oh man, Jocko and I think we could have a good time. I really do. I mean, I do think it could be an amazing thing where Mr. Anti-War comes in here and talks to an actual Navy SEAL. And I do think I could learn a lot from him. And I'm not going to, and I will not pretend that he will learn from me. I'm not, my attitude is I know that he knows stuff that I don't know, and I want to learn it. So that's what I want to do with that. It sounds great.
You let me know and we'll fly you down here and hang out at the beach and do a podcast.
Love it. Yeah. I'm not rolling with you guys. I'm a striker. I don't grapple, but otherwise we're cool. All right, guys. All right, Darryl.
Times and let you beat me up a little bit.
Say that again.
Let me choke you a couple times and then I'll let you beat me up a little bit.
I'll let you choke. Yeah, no problem. No problem. It's a deal. Thank you, Darryl. Have a great day, and I'll talk soon.
Thanks, Dad. Take care.
Bye-bye.
This is the Unregistered podcast, and I'm Thaddeus Russell. To join the new Renegade University, go to renegadeuniversity.com. To join the new Unregistered Underground, the supporting listeners group for the podcast, go to unregisteredunderground.com. Thanks for listening.